The guttural roar of the leaf blower was an assault on the otherwise tranquil Saturday morning, a deliberate, ear-splitting intrusion that Thomas Tom Riley Sergeant, Major U.S. Army retired, had learned to endure with the same stoic patience he'd cultivated over 30 years of service. He was meticulously tending his small rose garden, a patch of vibrant color and defiant life, in his otherwise immaculately ordered front yard in the Liberty Glen subdivision. His left hand, a marvel of brushed titanium and intricate microservos, moved with surprising delicacy, pruning a wayward stem from his prized peace rose. The prosthetic, a state-of-the-art myoelectric limb, was an extension of himself, a testament to both his sacrifice in a forgotten war zone and the incredible resilience of the human spirit, aided by modern technology. The leaf blower suddenly cut out. Tom straightened, a reflexive tension coiling in his shoulders. He knew that silence was often just a prelude, and as if on cue, Karen Stevens, president of the Liberty Glen Homeowners Association, rounded the neatly trimmed privet hedge that separated their properties. Her face, usually set in lines of perpetual disapproval, was today a mask of something sharper, more aggressive. She carried the still warm leaf blower like a weapon. "Riley," she snapped, her voice as grating as the machine she'd just silenced. "This contraption," she gestured vaguely towards Tom's prosthetic arm, which was currently holding a pair of rose shears, "is making the other residents uncomfortable. It's unnatural. We have standards in Liberty Glen. We don't allow eyesores, and that thing is an affront." Tom sighed, a lifetime of dealing with ignorance and prejudice contained in that single exhalation. "Mrs. Stevens," he said, his voice calm, measured, "this contraption, as you so charmingly put it, is a medically prescribed prosthetic limb essential for my daily functioning. It is not an eyesore. It is a part of me. And it is certainly not violating any HOA covenant, aesthetic or otherwise." "It's clicking," Karen Stevens insisted, her eyes narrowed. "I can hear it clicking and whirring from my sunroom. It's disruptive, and frankly, it's metallic. It doesn't blend with the natural ethos of Liberty Glen. People are talking. They're saying it's freakish." Freakish? The word, ugly and sharp, hung in the otherwise pristine morning air. Tom felt a familiar cold anger begin to stir, an anger he had learned to control, to channel, but which never entirely vanished. "My arm is not up for discussion, Mrs. Stevens," he said, his voice hardening. "Nor is it your concern. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have roses to tend." He turned back to his garden, a clear dismissal. But Karen Stevens was not to be dismissed. He heard her quick, angry footsteps on the flagstone path behind him. Then the unthinkable, a sudden violent wrench at his left shoulder. Before he could react, his prosthetic arm, his lifeline, the limb that allowed him to cook, to drive, to tend his beloved roses, was ripped from its socket with a sickening, tearing sound of Velcro and straps and a painful jolt to his residual limb. He stumbled off balance, a cry of shock and pain escaping him. He turned aghast to see Karen Stevens holding his multi-$1,000 prosthetic arm aloft, her face contorted in a triumphant, hateful sneer. "See, it just comes right off," she shrieked. "It's not even real, you cyborg freak." And then, with a sudden, vicious movement, she hurled the complex, gleaming limb towards the street. It sailed through the air in a grotesque arc, landing with a sickening thud and a spray of shattered composite material near the curb before bouncing and skittering directly into the gaping maw of a storm drain, disappearing into the darkness below with a final metallic clang. Tom stared speechless, his left shoulder throbbing, his mind reeling from the sheer audacity, the sheer venom of the assault. His arm, gone, swallowed by the storm drain. He felt naked, violated, a phantom ache already blooming, where the prosthetic had been an echo of the original trauma that had taken his flesh and blood limb so many years ago. "There," Karen Stevens panted, a wild, almost ecstatic look in her eyes. "Problem solved. No more clicking. No more freak show. Maybe now you'll finally get the message and take your unnatural presence out of our decent, normal neighborhood." She threw the rose shears, which had clattered from the prosthetic's grip, onto his lawn. "And clean up your mess, Riley." With that, she turned on her heel and marched back towards her own perfectly manicured, perfectly soulless yard, leaving Tom standing there, bereft, his dignity in shreds, his essential connection to the world stolen and discarded like so much trash. It was at that precise moment that Commander Jessica Jess, Riley Tom's daughter, and the newly appointed chief of the Department of Veteran Justice pulled her car up to the curb in front of her father's house for their planned Saturday brunch. She saw her father standing slumped and ashen-faced by his rose bushes. She saw Karen Stevens retreating, a look of vicious satisfaction on her face, and she saw the gaping empty socket where her father's prosthetic arm should have been. Jess was out of the car before it had even fully stopped, her heart pounding with a sudden terrible dread. "Dad, what happened? Where's your arm?" Tom Riley looked at his daughter, his strong, stoic face, a face that had seen war and loss and endured unimaginable pain, now etched with a vulnerability that tore at Jess's soul. He raised his trembling, incomplete left arm and pointed towards the storm drain. She took it, Jess." He choked out, his voice hoarse with disbelief and a pain that was far deeper than physical. "Karen Stevens. She called me a cyborg freak, and she threw it down there." Jess's world narrowed to that storm drain, to her father's violated dignity, to the raw, hateful bigotry that had just been unleashed in this quiet suburban street. The chief of veteran justice, the woman who had dedicated her life to fighting for the rights and dignity of men and women like her father, felt a cold, precise rage ignite within her, a rage that was both deeply personal and fiercely professional. Karen Stevens had not just assaulted a decorated veteran. She had not just destroyed an expensive and essential piece of medical equipment. She had declared war on everything Jess Riley stood for, and Karen Stevens had absolutely no idea the full extent of the federal firestorm she had just brought down upon her own head. This wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. This was a federal hate crime. And Jess Riley was about to bring the full weight of her office and the United States government to bear. The immediate aftermath of Karen Stevens' shocking assault on Tom Riley was a blur of controlled fury and swift, decisive action on Jess's part. Her first priority was her father. Seeing him so vulnerable, stripped of his prosthetic and his dignity, was a visceral blow. She gently led him inside, settled him into his favorite armchair, her mind already cataloging the immediate needs, contacting his prosthetist for an emergency replacement or repair assessment, managing his inevitable phantom limb pain, which would be exacerbated by the trauma, and most importantly, reassuring him that he was not alone, that this outrage would not stand. "She will pay for this, Dad," Jess said, her voice quiet, but imbued with an unshakable resolve as she knelt before him, taking his remaining hand. "Every conceivable way she will pay. I promise you that." Tom, still dazed, just nodded, his eyes fixed on the empty space where his left arm should have been. The psychological wound, Jess knew, would be as profound as the physical inconvenience and the financial cost of replacing a limb that was valued at well over $100,000. Once she was sure her father was as comfortable as possible with a neighbor, a fellow veteran named Mike, who had rushed over after witnessing part of the altercation. Sitting with him, Jess stepped outside. Her demeanor shifted. The concerned daughter receded, and Commander Riley, Chief of Veteran Justice, took her place. Her office, a specialized federal agency, had broad jurisdiction over crimes and discrimination targeting veterans, including the enforcement of specific statutes protecting their rights and access to care. Karen Stevens' actions fell squarely, brutally within that jurisdiction. She first called 911 to report the assault and theft of property, ensuring a local police presence to secure the immediate scene and take initial statements. Then she made a second call to her direct deputy at the Department of Veteran Justice, Mark Cole. "Mark, it's Jess," she said, her voice tight with a cold, controlled anger. "I need you to initiate a Code 1 priority alert. Hate crime targeting a disabled veteran assault with aggravated circumstances, destruction of essential medical equipment, a high-end prosthetic limb. The victim is Sergeant Major Thomas Riley, my father. The perpetrator is a civilian, Karen Stevens, president of his HOA. She's on site at her residence. I want a federal investigative team here yesterday, full press." Mark Cole, a seasoned investigator and a veteran himself, didn't waste time with expressions of shock, though Jess could hear the grim intake of his breath. "Understood, Commander. Team is wheels up in 30. What's the local LE situation?" "Local PD is en route. I need our team to take lead on the federal charges, violations of the ADA as it pertains to veterans' potential violations of the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act and anything else our legal eagles can find. This was targeted Mark. She called him a cyborg freak and threw his life down a storm drain. God damn her, Mark swore softly. We'll nail her to the wall, Jess. You have my word. You focus on your dad. We'll handle the legal assault. The arrival of local police was followed by a swift, almost cinematic convergence of city public works crews tasked with the immediate difficult job of trying to retrieve Tom's prosthetic from the storm drain. The operation was complex, involving specialized cameras and grappling equipment. Neighbors gathered at a respectful distance, their faces a mixture of shock, concern, and in some cases, a dawning shame. Karen Stevens watched from her perfectly manicured lawn, arms crossed, a smirk playing on her lips, seemingly oblivious to the gravity of the situation or the steely-eyed federal agents who had now discreetly positioned themselves around her property. Hours later, after a painstaking effort that involved temporarily diverting water flow and sending a remote-controlled retrieval unit deep into the subterranean drainage system, the prosthetic arm was recovered. It was a mangled wreck. The impact of the fall, the corrosive elements within the storm drain had shattered the delicate carbon fiber casing, fried the intricate myoelectric sensors, and corroded the precision-engineered joints. It was the lead public works supervisor told Jess with genuine regret, irreparable. The cost to replace it would be astronomical, and the waiting list for a custom-built limb of that sophistication was months, if not longer. Tom Riley, when informed, absorbed the news with a quiet stoicism that broke Jess's heart. He had lost that arm once in combat, a sudden, violent trauma. To lose it again in this petty, hateful way, in the supposed safety of his own neighborhood, was a cruelty almost beyond comprehension. The phantom pains Jess knew would be severe. His independence, so hard-won, would be drastically curtailed. The federal investigation led by Mark Cole, under Jess's direct though officially recused oversight, moved with lightning speed. Karen Stevens was formally arrested later that day by federal agents from the Department of Veteran Justice, charged with multiple felonies, including willful destruction of medical equipment valued over $1,000, a specific federal statute protecting veterans' prosthetics and mobility devices, assault on a disabled individual, and preliminary charges under federal hate crime legislation. The evidence was overwhelming. Multiple eyewitnesses, including Mike and another neighbor who had seen the entire incident security camera footage from a house across the street that had captured the assault and Karen's hateful slurs and Karen's own arrogant, unrepentant statements to the arresting officers. Her bail hearing was a contentious affair. The assistant U.S. attorney, armed with a scathing victim impact statement from Jess, detailing the profound harm to her father and the clear evidence of hate-based motivation, argued vehemently against bail, citing Karen as a flight risk and a continuing danger to the community, particularly to vulnerable veterans. Karen's expensive defense attorney, a slick operator known for representing white-collar criminals, tried to portray her as a pillar of the community, a dedicated volunteer, who had simply had a momentary lapse in judgment during a heated neighborhood dispute. The judge, a no-nonsense former JAG officer, was not impressed. Bail was set at an extraordinarily high amount, one that even Karen Stevens, with her apparent affluence, struggled to meet immediately. She spent several nights in a federal detention center, a stark contrast to her luxurious Liberty Glen home, before her bewildered husband finally managed to secure the bond. The conditions of her release were stringent house arrest, with electronic monitoring, a complete surrender of her passport, a strict no-contact order with Tom Riley or any member of his family, and a prohibition from engaging in any HOA-related activities or holding any position of authority within the community. Liberty Glen effectively was now without its HOA president, and the power vacuum, combined with the shock of Karen's crimes, sent ripples of chaos and recrimination through the normally placid subdivision. But Karen Stevens, it soon became clear, was not one to accept defeat gracefully. While her direct actions were curtailed, her capacity for malice was not. The first wave of her counterattack was subtle, insidious. Anonymous posts began appearing on neighborhood social media forums defending Karen, questioning Tom Riley's true military record, suggesting he was milking his disability for sympathy and special treatment. Rumors circulated that Tom had provoked Karen, that he was mentally unstable due to PTSD, that Jess was abusing her federal power to wage a personal vendetta. It was a classic smear campaign designed to poison the well of community support and discredit the victims. Then came the more direct harassment carefully orchestrated to stay just within the bounds of plausible deniability. Piles of leaves would mysteriously appear on Tom's lawn just after he had painstakingly raked them. His morning newspaper would be missing or found shredded at the end of his driveway. Late-night hang-up calls became frequent, small, unsettling things designed to create an atmosphere of anxiety and intimidation. Jess installed a state-of-the-art security system around her father's house, complete with multiple cameras and motion sensors, but the sense of being under siege was pervasive. Tom, without his prosthetic, struggled. His phantom limb pain, always a lurking presence, intensified to an agonizing degree. Simple daily tasks, dressing, cooking, even opening a jar, became monumental challenges. His rose garden, his pride and joy, began to show signs of neglect. He grew withdrawn, his natural optimism overshadowed by a weary frustration and a deep, simmering anger. He refused to leave the house, much feeling exposed, vulnerable, and ashamed of his new enforced dependency. Jess watched his decline with a heavy heart, her resolve to see Karen Stevens pay for her cruelty hardening with each passing day. The HOA, rudderless and reeling, became another battleground. Karen's remaining loyalists on the board, though, diminished in number, tried to obstruct any official condemnation of her actions. They floated proposals to mediate the situation, to find an amicable resolution that would involve Tom accepting an apology and the HOA perhaps contributing a token amount towards a new prosthetic. An offer Jess, on her father's behalf, rejected with contempt. She made it clear that this was not a neighborhood squabble to be smoothed over. This was a federal hate crime, and there would be no resolution short of full legal accountability. The Department of Veteran Justice, meanwhile, was building an ironclad case. They delved into Karen Stevens' background, searching for any prior history of discriminatory behavior or abuse of power. They interviewed dozens of Liberty Glen residents, uncovering a disturbing pattern of Karen's petty tyrannies, her microaggressions against anyone she deemed different or not up to Liberty Glen standards. The elderly couple with the too bright garden gnomes, the young family whose children made too much noise, playing in their own yard, the disabled resident whose request for a reserved parking spot near the community pool had been repeatedly denied by Karen on spurious grounds. One particularly disturbing story emerged from a former HOA board member who had resigned and discussed years earlier. She recounted how Karen Stevens had systematically pushed for bylaw changes that made it more difficult for residents with disabilities to get approved for necessary home modifications, how she had consistently opposed any HOA expenditure on accessibility features, and how she had often made disparaging remarks in closed board meetings about those people expecting special handouts. This wasn't just a one-off explosion of bigotry against Tom Riley. This was a deeply ingrained prejudice, a pattern of discriminatory conduct that Karen had wielded under the color of her HOA authority for years. This information became a crucial part of the federal hate crime enhancement. The prosecution wasn't just arguing that Karen's attack on Tom was hateful, they were building a case that she had a history of animus towards individuals with disabilities and veterans, and that her actions were part of a larger, deliberate effort to create a hostile environment for them within Liberty Glen. Jess, while officially recused from direct involvement in her father's case, used her position as Chief of Veteran Justice to shine a spotlight on the broader issues it raised. She authorized her office to conduct a full review of HOA practices in communities with high veteran populations across the state, looking for patterns of discrimination or abuse. She began working with legislators to draft tougher state laws protecting veterans and individuals with disabilities from targeted harassment and ensuring that HOA boards could be held accountable for fostering discriminatory environments. The attack on her father had become a catalyst for systemic change. The midpoint twist in the case came from an unexpected source. During a routine review of the Liberty Glen HOA's financial records subpoenaed as part of the investigation into Karen Stevens' abuse of power, a forensic accountant in Jess's department noticed a series of highly irregular transactions. Large sums of money had been paid out from HOA reserve funds to a vaguely named consulting firm for community beautification projects that seemed to have no tangible results. Further digging revealed that this consulting firm was a shell corporation, and its sole proprietor was Karen Stevens' estranged nephew, a man with a history of minor financial crimes. It appeared that Karen Stevens wasn't just a bigot and a bully. She was also an embezzler. She had been systematically siphoning off HOA funds for years, enriching herself and her family under the guise of maintaining community standards. Her obsessive control over the HOA, her vicious attacks on anyone who challenged her authority or threatened to scrutinize her actions, suddenly took on a new, more sinister dimension. It wasn't just about prejudice. It was about protecting her lucrative criminal enterprise. Her attack on Tom Riley, while undoubtedly fueled by hate, might also have been a panicked attempt to silence a respected community member who, if he delved too deeply into HOA affairs, might uncover her financial crimes. This discovery transformed the federal case against Karen Stevens from a serious hate crime prosecution into a potential RICO-level investigation involving fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy on top of the assault and discrimination charges. The U.S. Attorney's Office, already committed to vigorously prosecuting Karen, now had even more ammunition. The pressure on Karen Stevens, already immense, ratcheted up to an almost unbearable level. Her expensive lawyer, realizing his client was facing the possibility of decades in federal prison on multiple fronts, began to look even more stressed. Jess felt a cold, grim satisfaction at this new development. Karen Stevens' greed, her corruption, might be the very thing that ensured her permanent downfall. The fight for her father's dignity had inadvertently uncovered a rot that went to the very core of their community's leadership. The upcoming HOA emergency town hall meeting, which Karen, in a display of astonishing arrogance, still planned to attend and try to control her house arrest, allowed for pre-approved legal and community meetings, was now shaping up to be a truly spectacular implosion. Jess Riley, armed with the truth about Karen's hate and her greed, was ready to deliver the final devastating blows. The battle for Liberty Glen was about to reach its explosive climax. The Liberty Glen Community Clubhouse was packed to the rafters, the air thick with a palpable mixture of anger, anxiety, and a grim, expectant curiosity. Word had spread like wildfire about the impending showdown, about Commander Riley's intent to confront Karen Stevens publicly about the explosive revelations of financial misconduct that had begun to leak out despite the ongoing federal investigation. This wasn't just an HOA meeting anymore, it was a public reckoning. Jess sat in the front row with her father Tom, who, despite the pain and the humiliation he had endured, insisted on being there. He wore his dress blues, his chest adorned with the medals he had earned defending his country, his remaining hand resting on the polished wood of his temporary, purely cosmetic prosthetic, a loaner from the VA that offered little functionality but restored a measure of his formidable presence. Several other veterans from the community, friends and supporters of Tom, sat with them, a silent, powerful honor guard. Karen Stevens made her entrance flanked by her beleaguered-looking husband and her even more stressed-looking attorney. She attempted an air of defiant confidence, but the strain was evident in the tightness around her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands. The remaining HOA board members, pale and visibly uncomfortable, took their seats at the head table, a panel of condemned men and women awaiting their fate. The meeting began chaotically, with the acting HOA president, a flustered accountant named Howard Green, trying vainly to maintain order. But the residents were in no mood for procedural niceties. Shouts of "resign" and "thief" and "justice for Tom Riley" echoed through the room. Karen Stevens' attorney repeatedly objected, citing his client's right to due process and decrying the mob mentality. But his protests were largely drowned out. Finally, Jess Riley was given the floor. A hush fell over the room as she approached the podium, her expression calm, her voice steady, but with an undercurrent of cold, righteous fury that was impossible to miss. "Good evening." She began, her gaze sweeping across the assembled residents before settling on Karen Stevens. "We are here tonight because a member of our community, a decorated combat veteran, Sergeant Major Thomas Riley, was viciously assaulted, his essential medical equipment stolen and destroyed, and his dignity violated by the president of our Homeowners Association, Ms. Karen Stevens." With meticulous, damning precision, Jess laid out the facts of the assault, the eyewitness accounts, the security camera footage which she had arranged to be played on a large screen for all to see, the hateful slur, "Cyborg freak," echoing chillingly through the silent room, the irreparable damage to Tom's advanced prosthetic limb, and the profound physical and psychological harm inflicted on her father. She spoke of the hate crime charges Karen was facing, the clear evidence of discriminatory animus. Then she moved to the financial misconduct. But Ms. Stevens' contempt for the law and for the members of this community, it appears, did not stop with acts of personal bigotry and violence. It extended to a systematic betrayal of your trust and a theft of your hard-earned money. She presented a summarized but devastating overview of the forensic accounting findings, the shell corporations, the inflated invoices, the payments for non-existent beautification projects, the hundreds of thousands of dollars siphoned from HOA reserve funds into accounts linked to Karen Stevens and her nephew. She displayed copies of falsified documents of checks signed by Karen for exorbitant sums paid to her nephew's phantom company. This wasn't just mismanagement. Residents of Liberty Glen just declared, her voice ringing with accusation. This was calculated criminal fraud. While you paid your dues trusting they were being used to maintain and improve our community, Ms. Stevens was treating the HOA treasury as her personal piggy bank, funding a lifestyle far beyond her legitimate means, all while systematically discriminating against and harassing vulnerable members of this community, perhaps to silence anyone who might look too closely at her financial dealings. The reaction in the room was explosive. Homeowners who had been personally victimized by Karen's petty tyrannies, who had questioned the endless fee hikes or the shoddy workmanship of HOA-approved contractors, now saw the full ugly picture. Cries of outrage, of betrayal, of demands for Karen's immediate imprisonment filled the air. Karen Stevens herself seemed to shrink under the weight of the accusations, her face ashen, her composure finally shattering. She began to shout incoherently, protesting her innocence, blaming her nephew, blaming ungrateful residents, blaming Tom Riley for provoking her. It was at that moment, as the chaos reached its peak, that the doors at the back of the clubhouse opened, and a phalanx of federal agents led by Mark Cole and accompanied by Assistant U.S. Attorney Ramirez entered the room. They moved with quiet, purposeful efficiency, cutting a path through the stunned crowd towards the head table. Karen Stevens, AUSA Ramirez, announced, her voice clear and amplified by a portable bullhorn. You are under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government, in addition to the pending federal charges of assault and committing a hate crime. This HOA is now under federal investigation, and all assets are frozen pending a full forensic audit. Karen Stevens let out a strangled scream as she was handcuffed and read her rights, her carefully constructed world imploding around her in a maelstrom of public disgrace and federal charges. Her husband looked on aghast and impotent. Her lawyer simply sighed and shook his head, a man who knew when the battle was irretrievably lost. Several other HOA board members implicated in the financial scandal through their negligence or active participation were also served with subpoenas and informed they were targets of the ongoing investigation. As Karen Stevens was led away, sobbing and disheveled, a spontaneous cheer erupted from the assembled residents. It was not a cheer of vengeance, but of liberation, of a community finally freed from a reign of bigotry and corruption. Tom Riley watched her go, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, with the help of his daughter, he rose to his feet. The residents of Liberty Glen, many of them in tears, surged forward, not with anger now, but with apologies, with expressions of support, with a dawning understanding of the courage it had taken for one man and his daughter to stand up to such entrenched malice. Jess Riley, standing beside her father, felt a profound sense of exhaustion, but also of fierce, quiet pride. The fight had been brutal, the wounds deep, but tonight, justice had been served. Not just for Tom Riley, but for every veteran, every disabled individual, every person who had ever been targeted or marginalized by an abuse of power. The battle for Liberty Glen was over. The long, difficult work of healing, of rebuilding, of creating a community truly worthy of its name was just beginning. And Jess knew with an unshakable certainty that her father, Sergeant Major Thomas Riley, with his indomitable spirit and his unwavering sense of honor, would be at the forefront of that effort, a true leader once more. The legal and financial unraveling of Karen Stevens and the compromised Liberty Glen HOA was a protracted and messy affair, but its outcome was never truly in doubt. Faced with an insurmountable mountain of evidence on both the hate crime and the massive fraud charges, Karen Stevens' expensive legal team eventually negotiated a global plea agreement. She pleaded guilty to multiple federal felonies, including assault on a disabled veteran committing a hate crime, wire fraud, and money laundering. The judge, a decorated veteran herself, who listened with visible disgust to the victim impact statements from Tom Riley and other Liberty Glen residents Karen had terrorized, sentenced her to the upper end of the federal guidelines, 15 years in a federal penitentiary, with no possibility of parole for at least 12. She was also ordered to pay millions in restitution to the HOA and the federal government, and stripped of nearly all her assets, including her lavish Liberty Glen home, which was seized and sold to help cover the HOA's massive debts. Several of her co-conspiring board members also faced lesser charges, receiving sentences ranging from probation and hefty fines to short prison terms for their roles in the embezzlement scheme. The Liberty Glen HOA, under the guidance of a federally appointed receiver and a newly elected board of honest, dedicated residents, including Tom Riley, who was overwhelmingly voted in as the new president, began the arduous process of financial and communal reconstruction. The stolen funds were largely unrecoverable, but through a combination of stringent budgeting, community fundraising, and a new ethos of transparency and shared responsibility, they slowly began to climb out of the hole Karen Stevens had dug. One of the new board's first official acts was to pass the Sergeant Major Thomas Riley Resolution, a sweeping set of bylaws that enshrined protections for veterans and residents, with disabilities mandated full ADA compliance for all community facilities, and established an independent ethics oversight committee. Tom Riley received a new state-of-the-art prosthetic arm, its cost covered by a combination of VA benefits expedited by Jess's office, a significant contribution from a national veterans advocacy group that had taken up his cause, and donations from a now galvanized Liberty Glen community. The first time he was able to effortlessly pick a rose from his beloved garden with his new fully functional limb, his eyes shining with unshed tears, Jess knew that this was a victory more profound than any courtroom verdict. His spirit, though battered, remained unbroken. He poured his energy into leading the new HOA, transforming it from an instrument of oppression into a genuine force for community betterment, his leadership marked by the same integrity, fairness, and quiet strength that had defined his military career. Jess Riley's Department of Veteran Justice used the Liberty Glen case as a national model, developing new training protocols for investigating and prosecuting hate crimes and financial fraud targeting veterans. The case led to strengthened federal regulations regarding HOA accountability and the protection of vulnerable residents. Jess herself became an even more prominent and respected voice in the fight for veteran justice, her personal connection to the issue lending a powerful authenticity to her advocacy. Months later, Liberty Glen hosted its first annual Veterans and Community Unity Day. The sun shone brightly on the newly renovated community park, now fully accessible with smooth pathways, adaptive playground equipment, and a memorial garden dedicated to local veterans. Tom Riley, standing tall and proud in his dress, blues his new prosthetic gleaming, gave a moving speech about resilience, community, and the enduring importance of standing up to hate and corruption. Jess watched him from the crowd, her heart full. Her father, who had been so cruelly targeted and violated, was now a symbol of hope and healing for their entire community. As the celebration continued, with families laughing, children playing, and veterans sharing stories, Jess saw the tangible results of their long, hard fight. Liberty Glen was no longer a place defined by petty tyranny and hidden malice. It was becoming a community where respect, inclusivity, and mutual support were not just aspirational words, but lived realities. The scars of Karen Stevens's reign would linger, a reminder of the darkness they had overcome. But the spirit of Liberty Glen, forged in adversity and renewed by a commitment to justice, was stronger, brighter, and more resilient than ever before. The battle had been won, not just for one veteran, but for the very soul of a neighborhood, and that Jess knew was a legacy worth fighting for.